much time as possible. If everyone that has not received a handout except the 7th through 10th, we'll give you some here in just a second if you're interested. But everyone else that's attending this, if you have not received a handout, would you raise your hand? Letitia up here. If you're 7th through 10th, we'll give you one here in just a moment, okay? But, all right. Anyone else in the back here? All right. Heidi might need one. She's coming in and Stormy. All right. Now, 7th through 10th. If you're going to utilize these, we will give you one, all right? If you're going to make paper airplanes with it or whatever, I think you have regular note paper that you can do that on. But if you really want one, we will definitely give you one. How many would want one? Okay. Is that the only one we have left? Okay, I need to save that for copies. So I'll see what I can do about getting some copies here in just a moment, all right? Well, it has been a joy to have this Worldchangers Week. It's been a joy to hear from Dr. Dewhurst, quite interesting. When I was here in school, Dr. Dewhurst's father, who is here, Brother Kim Dewhurst, was in school, and we went to school together. Had classes together, and then I pastored and came back to work at the school and decided I was going to take Greek. And Dr. Dewhurst and I and Andy Strout was in the same Greek class together. So that was quite interesting. I went to class with both of them. But it is so good to have Dr. Marlin Hotle. I have so deeply appreciated what he has given. Let's open our hearts as he is going to share with us the effective tools for today's challenges. And so let's open our heart as he comes and gives to us what he has prepared.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whitaker, and it has been a real delight and a joy to be back on campus this week. And I just so enjoyed that challenge this morning that Dr. Dewhurst shared, and I thought it was really beautiful the way the Lord works things together, because really his summation plenary session this morning dovetailed right in with the first two messages we preached concerning holiness and what it is, and I am convinced that's the heart of the matter, and I certainly appreciated that. The assignment that I've had for today is effective tools for today's challenges, and I'll try to go through these. I don't know that I have many answers, but some things that I'd like to share. I don't know about you, but I'm getting tired of hearing me talk. Brother Wolf and I were talking this morning. He was one of my former professors, and we were talking this morning. We're both feeling the effects of our age, because I didn't realize I'd be this tired at this point in the week. I think I almost bit off more than I can chew, but it's been a real delight. But I want to look at effective tools. The first one that I want to look at is virtual care texting. This one, I stumbled on quite by accident, but never dreamed that it could be such an effective tool. I serve, among other things, as a commercial chaplain with Marketplace Chaplains, and do about 67 hours a month in various locations, 7 different facilities or locations. And in one of them, I am chaplain for a team of doctors that are, instead of having an office, they'll work in rural settings or whatever, and it's almost like a jobbing group, where they're given assignments, and they may work somewhere 2 months, 3 months, and then move somewhere else. And so it's hard for me to see them on a regular basis. In other words, and I'm going to be there, I've got to drive tonight, and I'm meeting with a team of doctors tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock in Knoxville, Tennessee. So a part of my assignment is what we call virtual care. And what that means is that I text various people maybe once a week and let them know I'm praying for them and find out if there's anything in particular, any way I can help them. We have an app on their phones that they can actually either text me and they touch my picture, it comes to me directly. They can even FaceTime me by touching it and it'll call my phone and we can see each other. But it's been amazing to me. I have actually led a man to the Lord who was contemplating suicide. That's been about 5 years ago, and he's in church and very actively serving the Lord. And I didn't dream virtual care could be so effective. So from that prompting, the Lord several years ago now prompted me to develop a prayer list of people as He laid it on my heart to add them, that I would pray for them. And then now it's over 100, so every 3 weeks they'll get a text from me saying, I just want you to know I'm praying for you and your family, and etc. Several of them on that prayer list are former students. Dr. Whitaker is one of them that is on that list, and a number of others that several of my former students like Daniel Edwards and John Ziegler, or others. And it's amazing to me how many times those pastors will text me back and say, Brother Hotle, this couldn't have come at a better time. I'm dealing with something. I remember, and he's gone home to be with the Lord, but one of them that was on the list was Dr. John Nyhoff, who was the president of Wesley Biblical Seminary. And on one occasion, it was my day to text him, let him know that I was praying for him. And he literally called me during the break an hour or so later during a board meeting. And they had a board member that was throwing a carnal tantrum and going to quit. And he said, Marlin, you couldn't have texted at a better time. And he told me what he wanted me to pray about and said, please, please spend today praying. And the next morning he texted me and said, oh, brother, I want you to know he got up this morning and apologized, and we just had a prayer meeting, and we were, hugging, and it was all, and it wasn't probably 2 or 3 months after that Dr. Nyhoff went home to be with the Lord, just in his 50s. But I do feel bad at times because in the last month, I've held revivals for 2 of the pastors that I text, and both of them, I didn't have the heart to correct them. But they said, Brother Hotle texts me every week that he's praying for me. And it's really every 3rd week, because I text so many a day. But they talked about how much it meant to them to know that they were being lifted in prayer. And I after thinking about that, and I mentioned it to my pastor, and he's doing it now, I said, if I were pastoring today, I would break my membership down, and at least once a week, I would text everyone whose phone number I had that was a part of my church and say, I just want you to know your pastor's praying for you today. And if I can help you in any way, if there's anything that I can do, I really believe, and it wasn't my idea, I discovered it by accident, and I've broadened it to pastors and ministers that I pray for. But I think it's been one of the most effective tools, and we call it through Marketplace virtual care. And I would certainly recommend that, and I don't know why this thing keeps wanting to go off. Let me see if I can get it in a different mode. Well, I apologize. Hopefully it won't keep going off. The next one, Facebook Live, and I want to look at strengths and weaknesses. The strengths, and so many of our holiness churches are live streaming their services, and I enjoy them. I admit that. In fact, even this week, these services, these sessions have been live streamed. And just this morning, I heard from another pastor in Tennessee. I've heard from a number of former students that when I'd get to the room at night, they'd say, watched you tonight, Dr. Hotle, and it's just so good to hear you and see you again and all this. So, and I thank the Lord for the opportunity. So there are advantages. The one disadvantage I mentioned the other day, I say disadvantage, but one of the weaknesses that worries me is that I fear that it also in some ways has become an easy substitute, because where maybe I would have members that might miss church once or twice a year, now they would miss 7, 8, 10 times a year and would justify themselves by saying, well, I watched it on Facebook and really enjoyed it. And if we're not careful, it becomes a substitute for the assembling of ourselves together. I've found this to be true in older people in our own church where I'm a member. They'll go to Walmart, they'll go get groceries on Friday, but they will feel justified by just watching the services on Sunday and not getting out and going to church. The other thing is, quite honestly, I think Facebook in many ways is dangerous. I think it has created, I could go into a litany of things. There are things psychologically that, I don't have time to deal with, and that's not my area, but it creates false realities at times. It tends to reunite people that maybe haven't seen each other in years, and I've known marriages that have been destroyed. There are a lot of dangers to Facebook, and so it has both advantages and disadvantages. One that comes to my mind, one of my son-in-law, my youngest daughter, her husband pastors, and they have Facebooked Live for several years now, but they didn't start it until COVID. And during those times, he would go over when they weren't allowed by the state of Kentucky to have live services. He would go over on Sunday morning, and my daughter would live stream it, and they would have their service live. And they have the option to do online giving. And he had a first cousin in Illinois that started watching it. Never went to church, never darkened a church door, but because he had that option to watch his cousin, he did. And 3 or 4 weeks into watching, he called Gene, and he had given his heart to the Lord. And he started tithing regular. Now, that's all good, but here's my weakness. Now, he's been a Christian for 3 years, and instead of getting a church, he's watching Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and tithing to a church that he'll never be to. And it's given him a way to feel justified and feel like, he has a church when it's not his church. And that troubles me. But there are some strengths, and I know that some churches limit who can watch it to shut-ins or whatever, and there are ways to do that. I'm not sure what all the answers are. I think that it's a good tool, and yet I think that it is a tool that also has some things that we need to be aware of. Another option is to post your services on a YouTube channel. And if you do this, I would encourage you to have your own YouTube channel. Our church does, a number of them do. Our church's is by subscription. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to pay at all, but so that they can track who's watching it and, keep it from being used by anybody and everybody out there. If they preach something close, they limit the access to those who sign up. And you don't pay anything, but when I'm not able to be in my church, oftentimes when I'm away in revival, I'll watch Sunday afternoon what is happening on Sunday morning. And quite honestly, it's an encouragement. Even since I've been here, I've heard from some of our church people, because Sunday morning they prayed for me at my home church while I'm out, and I'm in a string right now where for about 7 weeks I'm not able to be there in my home church. And so it's encouraging to me to know that I'm being lifted up. And this is an easy thing. It doesn't cost the church to set up a YouTube channel, and that's another option. Another thing that is becoming more and more common is offering electronic giving. In fact, I've held revivals in 2 churches this fall that no longer takes up an offering. They just post in their bulletin, you can give online, here's the website. And one of the advantages is, quite honestly, my children, I get tickled at them but none of my 3 daughters carry cash. They just don't use cash. And they have a debit card, but they don't use it often. They do almost 90% electronically. They even order their groceries electronically and go to Kroger or Walmart and pick them up at the door. That's a new generation. That's not my thing. I still like cash. But, electronic giving, more and more churches are at least giving that as an option. But again, there are 2 weaknesses. I don't know, there may be a free service out there that I'm not aware of. But most of the services that I'm aware of have a 1.5% surcharge, which means that either the church is going to have to give 1.5% of what was given electronically for the service, or the person who gives electronically is going to have 1.5% added to their gift. And I just don't like that. Maybe it's necessary, but electronic giving does have some advantages. Using a worship team to lead music is another one that I am finding more and more common, even in conservative churches. And I find there are some strengths and weaknesses to doing that. One of the strengths is that it does tend to involve more people in the worship service, and it gets people involved in leading. In our church, they have a worship team, and they require them to be there on Saturday, and they have a prayer meeting, and they go over everything that they're going to be doing in the Sunday services and practice, and I have no problem with that. The one weakness that I find, there are 2 weaknesses, and I'm going to get on one of my pet peeves. The music style oftentimes gravitates towards quote-unquote worship music when you have a worship team. And if we're not careful, it'll gravitate to what I call 3-2-1 choruses. Three chords, 2 words, 1 hour. And they're shallow and meaningful or meaningless songs. And even in conservative churches, I'll hold revivals at times and not hear a single hymn the whole week. And I'm not against all of the worship choruses. In fact, there is a movement now to create what they call modern hymns, and I'm not fully against that as long as they're the right kind. In fact, we sang one this week. Did you know we sang a modern hymn this week here in a night service? Written by Gloria Gaither. It's not, now the melody dates back to, if I remember right, several hundred years, but the words, which are clearly a hymn, is a modern hymn. So I'm not, they've done that in a more modern context to Amazing Grace, and of course added the worship chorus. And one thing I like about it is that a couple of the verses that they sing with the worship version are original verses that are not in our hymnal. Like the earth shall soon dissolve like snow, the sun refused to shine. That's all by Newton. And so I'm not against all of that, but the hymns, I just don't want to see us get away from those songs of depth and quality. So I'm not against worship teams. I think there can be some benefits in involving others that are not normally a part of the process, but I do think there are also some dangers that we have to be aware of. Using PowerPoint is another one that, especially as an evangelist, is really, there are pros and cons. If I were pastoring Wednesday night when I would do a Bible study, I like to use PowerPoint. At our church, Wednesday night's actually my favorite time of the week for us. When I'm home, oftentimes my pastor will have me do maybe a 6-week series in January and early February before I'm out on the road again. and I like using PowerPoint, handing handouts. That's fine. We actually have our midweek service in the fellowship hall because teens and children use the church facility, and it's not a matter of food or anything else. We just meet over there. We are at tables. We can have more of a classroom setting. We actually pray for about 20 minutes, at the beginning, but it just actually it is one of the best attended. I'm amazed because people love to get in the Word, and it's really been very effective for us. But as an evangelist, I hate PowerPoint. Not this summer wasn't so bad. Only one of the camps that I preached this summer used it. But I'll go to camps now, some of the larger old camps, where they'll say, now listen, we want your sermon on PowerPoint. We want everything there. And the problem I have as an evangelist is it keeps me under bondage because, either the person back there, I don't want to flip it myself. And if they try to do it, they're either ahead of me or behind me or lost. Or God may lead another direction and I just leave out a point or two, and take a detour. And so there are disadvantages, and yet there are advantages because you will retain more when you involve more than one sensor. When you involve what you see as well as what you hear, you retain more. There's no question about that. And so there are places where I can find it and do find it an effective tool, but other places where it is a weakness to me. Church library is one of them, and I want to find my notes on this one because I want to make you aware. Yes, here we go. Books are rapidly becoming a thing of the past. I hate that. But bookstores are in decline. Finding classics are in decline. And our people are not, they are not getting the doctrinal foundation so often in our churches. And I'm afraid that we're going to lose our distinctive message within this decade if we're not very, very careful. And everywhere I pastored, I had a church library. I really believe in them. And maybe your younger people won't read quite as much, but your older people will enjoy it. But you need to encourage your younger people. We literally had ours at Frankfurt, operated on the Dewey Decimal System. I had a librarian who worked at the public library, and she was there Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night to check out books. And we had literally hundreds of books in the library. My daughter has tried that in Ashland, and it amazed me how it struck a responsive chord. She received donations, financial and otherwise, from 3 or 4 states away where people liked the concept of what they were doing, and they now have a very well-equipped library. If not hardback, one thing that you can do is encourage your people through the bulletin to electronically download. Did you know that there are holiness books that can be downloaded free of charge on a monthly basis, and the library is extensive and many of them are classics? Let me give you the email address. I don't have it there in your paper, but it is simply holinesslegacy, one word, .com. holinesslegacy.com. And every month they will upload a new book, but once it's uploaded, it's there. So in other words, you could go back this afternoon if you wanted to and download 30 or 40 holiness books. Some of them are newer. Most of them there are classics. But boy, there are some rich materials there. In fact, I haven't even had a chance to look at it this week, but in my briefcase in the car, I have my iPad with me. And I probably have 60 holiness classics on my iPad right now. And last week, I had more time when I was in revival, and every day I'm reading, one of those classics. And your people need good material. They need reading. And so I think a church library is great. If you can't do it again physically, electronically, make your people aware of what's there And there are so many good resources. You'll find holiness sermons, some of them dating back years, that are available online for free downloads, both just audio and video. And I would encourage you to help your people to find good materials. The next one that I looked at is preach principles, not politics. Now, I'm going to get sidetracked here, and this may get in trouble, but the good thing is it's the last day, and so I'm going home. I have been increasingly troubled by, well, I'm just going to say it, okay? By the way Trumpism has infiltrated the holiness movement. I am a conservative. I vote conservative. But the blind loyalty that overlooks moral decay and sin troubles me. I just don't get it. And you know what's happening? And really, Dr. Dewhurst has dealt with some of it if we would have listened. There is an anger, and a lot of times we don't even know what we're angry about. It just frustrates me. My wife's family in particular. It's getting uncomfortable. Every one of us, I'm just going to say it, we're all Republican. And we all vote conservative. But some of them are dyed in the wool, and some of them aren't as dyed in the wool. And we're fighting. God help us. And I mentioned the other day, the number one cause the under 35 group stopped going to churches because of the politics that are preached from the pulpit. See, I unequivocally don't mind at all preaching pro-life. I think it's biblical. Or dealing with some of the things like Dr. Dewhurst dealt with today. They're both biblical and necessary if we are to be who God intends for us to be. But I don't have to be political. Preach principles. Preach principles, not politics. Can I tell you, no party has ever brought about revival. And it never will. Let me see if I can get this thing to work again. Involve your church in your community. I touched on this a little in one of the points yesterday, but I think this is so critical. As conservative people, we have oftentimes drawn ourselves in instead of involving ourselves and building a reputation in the community. I tell you, a couple of individuals that came to my mind when I was thinking about this again this morning. He's gone home to be with the Lord now, but over the years I held Reverend Amos hand several revivals, and I don't know, some of you may have known Amos. Amos would beat you to death, man, I tell you. There were some things about going to hold him a revival I didn't like, but Amos's church there in Columbia was at one time in a good neighborhood, and the neighborhood started deteriorating, and the racial divide, and some of his people wanted to relocate. And Amos said, no, we're not. We're going to minister to this community. And he had the most unusual church when I would hold him revivals. It was probably a 50-50 split between blacks and whites. And I would really get humored because maybe we'd have two specials before I'd preach, and one of them would be a couple that, that sang the songs like we think of, at IHC or whatever, and then the next couple that got up may be from the black community, and they would sing, I don't mean a modern song, just the way they sing. And, and the people just loved each other. But Amos if you knew Amos Hand, he was always in the community, and there was never a more respected man in the community. I went to a flea market with him on Saturday in the community, and it was humorous because I came home with a bag full of stuff, several new ties, different things, and you know how many I got to pay for? None. And Amos didn't pay for them either. See, Amos is with me, and I'll see a tie I want, and I go to pay for it, and Amos will slap me on the back and say, this is my evangelist. And they said, preacher, it's yours. because that was the kind of respect that he had in the community. I'm a historian. That's what I do besides the revivals. And recently in an article, a post, I wrote about a lady who died really, I guess I was alive, but I don't remember it. But Knoxville, Tennessee still records it as the largest funeral in the history of the city. The Tennessee Bible Methodist Connection, there is the church called Hinton Street Mission. And the founders of the Hinton Street Mission that were there for years, it's in a slummy area in Knoxville, downtown Knoxville. They were always ministering to the derelicts and the alcoholics or whatever. And the pastor and his wife, they were old-fashioned, but she really was just the big-hearted, working in soup kitchens, whatever they could. But when she died, businesses all over Knoxville shut down, and they named that day in honor of her. This would have been back in the probably early 60s. And there were literally thousands of people that attended her funeral at the convention center. I think D.P. Denton probably preached it. But here was an old-fashioned holiness lady, but a husband and wife who had so impacted with their outreach that the whole city of Knoxville came to a stop. And if you've ever been in Hinton Street Mission back in the days, it's still in operation. In fact, one of my former students is the wife of the pastor there. But man, you'd see this long shotgun building and you would think it wouldn't seat anybody. And when you'd get in it, there'd be 200 people crammed in it. But the impact. And we need to find ways to make our light shine in the community so that they know that we're there. One who did it well when I was at Frankfurt, Mark Mowry. Again, there were, festivals downtown or whatever, but people knew where their church was and knew that it was a part of the Frankfurt community. So involve your church in your community. Well, I guess, is that my last one? No, it isn't. I don't know. There we go. It just acting up on me this morning. Revivals are still needed. I touched on this the other day. Even in my own family, it's amazing to me how many churches, even what we would think of as more conservative churches, have stopped having revivals altogether. Revivals are becoming a thing of the past, and oftentimes I'll hear ministers say, well, the people won't come. Well, I have found that they are only as effective as your belief in them and the preparation that you do ahead of time. When you believe in them, when you make preparation, in fact, it's amazing to me how many churches that really have no background in our movement, that are more modern churches, but they'll hear me preach somewhere and say, we want to have a revival and we want you to come. I held one in Northern Ohio. I was part of the Evangelical Friends Church. The pastor of that church had been in a motorcycle gang and had gotten saved at the Willoughby Hills Friends Church there, which was the old mother church that actually William Smith would have attended back when it was the Malones were alive. And I'd held a meeting there, and he had heard me, and then he planted a church dealing with people that were like he used to be, a motorcycle, up on one of the Great Lakes. And when he called me for a meeting, he said, now I want you to preach on holiness, but he said, I don't want you to give an altar call until Sunday morning. He said, I want to whet their appetite. I want them to be hungry by the time we open the altar. I thought, man, I've never heard of this before. And so, every night before I would preach, and he would say it again after, he said, now, Brother Hotle's going to preach something I think we need to hear. But he said, you can't come tonight. He said, be prepared. Sunday morning, we're going to open the altar. But he said, I want you to get the foundation. I want you to understand what you're doing before you come. And boy, every night I would preach, and every night, now you're not coming tonight. Sunday morning, I want you to be here. Sunday morning's your opportunity. I didn't know what to expect, but literally on Sunday morning, it looked like in mass. There were probably 400 or 500 that came forward. I'd never seen anything like it. But he had laid the stage. Now, I'll admit, every night service wasn't the same. What I mean is, one night we set up in the gym and had food and all, and then he said, all right, now, we had the singing and the preaching. Other nights it was just traditional, but every night he wanted me to preach on holiness. I built the theme, and on Sunday, I'm not saying we need to go that route, but we can find ways to make it effective. But we need those times of stirring, of refreshing, of looking at our own heart. A second problem that I've seen younger pastors do, and the reason they don't find it's effective, and I had a pastor like this. I told him, when I brought in an evangelist, I wanted to bring in someone who could preach better than I could. But a lot of younger preachers are intimidated, and they want to bring in someone who doesn't outshine them. And I wanted to be outshone. I wanted them to hear the best. And a lot of younger preachers, I think a lot of it is just they're intimidated. That's why they never, I'll go to churches with some of my own former students, and there'll be pastors there that are visiting, and they will not invite them to pray or not even recognize them. In fact, a lot of our churches will recognize no visitors whatsoever if they're there. And somewhere our ethics have changed and our ethos has changed, but revivals, I'm convinced, are still as necessary and needed as they ever were. And part of my reason is this. I know what God's called me to do, and God has not called me to do something that would not be needed. And I thank Him. He opens the doors, but we dare not get away. In fact, even our Bible schools, in many ways, I know we have our convocations, but the highlight of my year when I was a student at God's Bible School was camp meeting. Man, all we boys had to move downstairs and, in the basement there where the garage was, or earlier on when the old dining room still was standing, Army barracks, and we'd sleep in that thing crammed in there. And when we were downstairs in the room where the garage was, we all had to share one single shower that week. It was rough, but some of those great preachers that we would bring in, and the way God would move, and man, some of the greatest services that I ever attended were those camp meeting services, and they were times that really challenged and fed me, and it's a thing of the past. And I loved what Dr. Dewhurst said about the camp meetings this morning. You know what I'm discovering? We talk about camp meetings are dying, but it's not all camp meetings. See, because of the years I was with CHP, God opened the door for me beyond what would have been normal for me. And I get to hold some camp meetings that are thriving, that have no background with like us, okay? For example, Indian Springs in Georgia. Indian Springs, primarily Methodist people that attend. 1,500-acre campground. There will be over 3,000 people staying on the grounds. And they've never tried to limit me in what I preach. But there is a generation that, man, you preach on holiness and they'll line the altars. They're starved. I could point you to some in Indiana. I could point you in Ohio. Camps like Portage, camps like Hollow Rock, which is the oldest holiness camp in the nation. Camp Syker in Mount Vernon, where I can go, and their background, many of them would not know what a holiness church was, except they come to camp meeting. And there's a younger generation that grew up attending camps, and they want their kids to experience it. In fact, the first time I spoke at Houghton College in Houghton, New York, the way that invitation came is there was a professor there that had grown up attending a little old-fashioned camp, and he heard about Syker, and he would take his vacation from Houghton, a PhD, and bring a tent, and his family would sleep in a tent all week so his children could experience camp meeting. And Sychar is a unique camp. If you've never been there, they have a bathhouse still because the city won't let them have water in their cabins. The only cabin that had water in it was the evangelist quarters. And we had to share a shower and bathroom, all three of us in this 3 triplex. But the rest of them can't even have it and the cabins are right up against each other. I mean, it's like going back in time. The camp started in the 1860s. But it's thriving. We have become so pampered, and holiness camps are dying right and left, and yet there are camps outside of our movement where there are people that are hungry for a taste of the old-time kind of atmosphere and service, and I'm going to tell you, I think our people would be too if we made it a priority. Problem is for a lot of us, especially in my line and more main line, I don't want to get sidetracked here, and I'm going to end here in a moment, but for my denomination, I had the privilege at one point of preaching in every one of our district camps that still had camp meetings. But of those, there's only 2 of them, of the districts that still have camp meetings. Now, the camps are still in existence, like, for example, Frankfort, but it's not a Wesleyan camp. You know, it's an independent camp. Most of them now, if they're still in existence, Fairmount's the same way. It's really not a Wesleyan camp. I mean, it's Wesleyan, but it's independent. And the reason why they died is because when a DS was elected, they would generally elect some super pastor who had never gone to camp and didn't believe in camp. And they saw it as a financial millstone around their neck. And can I tell you, I have found that true even in the more conservative veins. We elect someone who never came to camp and never believed in camp. And so they're not going to promote camp. And the ones who really need it, the smaller churches who need that. And I'll be honest, if I was pastoring a church, give you a case in point, I love preaching at Findlay, Ohio, and they still go to camp. But when you're in an atmosphere like Travis Johnson's church, Chris Craven's before him, and there's a couple hundred people there and the music is as good or better than any camp meeting on any weekly basis, then I don't know that camp meeting has the same draw. Are you with me? Because they experience that atmosphere. But when you're at churches like my dad pastored, running 20 people, and you never hear that level of music and you never hear that level of preaching, getting together and seeing that there were other holiness people and that it wasn't just us 4 and no more. That's why I think IHC has always been so effective, because it gives us an opportunity to look around and be encouraged that there are those who still are committed to the message and the movement. Camp meeting is a part of that, and so I appreciated what Dr. Dewhurst shared this morning. Any questions about any of this? If you were looking for modern technology and ways, I'm old, so I'm sorry about it. But these are some tools that I have found to be effective. And if you get anything else, can I encourage you, the virtual texting, the virtual visiting, I think that's one of the most effective things that you could do. You don't know how much it would mean to your congregation to get a text from their pastor every week saying, I'm praying for you. Is there anything in particular that I can lift up for you? All right, any comments, any questions? Yes, sir. In the first session, we dealt with those challenges exclusively. I think I may have the brochure. Well, let me see if I can find it, and I'll go back and just highlight a few of those that we face. The study, or the ones that we looked at on Monday, and I don't have the time to go through all of them, but I will give you the resource, and then we looked at them in depth. They were based on a study that was published by Barna Institute in 2020, so it's fairly new. It was in Barna's State of the Pastor study. And what they did in that, they sent out, I think it was maybe 1,000 surveys. Naturally, they didn't get all of them back, but they got 547 of them back. So this study, the results of it was based on those 547 surveys. And it wasn't, they just ask you what is the number one challenge, but they ask each pastor to list. So then what they did is they listed them by percentage in order of how many surveys they appeared on. So the top one, see if I can find it, and I might just be able to go through them quickly without spending time with them. The top one had maybe, it might have had 73% or so, and then they would go down from there, and I'm not going to be able to draw it up quick. But another thing that skewed it and that we looked at was there were factors that changed how critical it was seen. Some of those factors, the surveys, the results, there were those who were part of mainline churches that answered, those that were part of evangelical churches. There was even a small percentage of those that were holiness churches. So the concern would be skewed by where they were theologically. But it was also tragically skewed by where they were age-wise. For example, in looking at the concern about theology and watered down gospel teaching on that particular one, it was skewed by where you were theologically. Those that were part of mainline churches didn't see that as a major issue, but those that were part of mainline or that were evangelical saw that as a big problem, teaching that was not biblical. And I will be honest, I shared in that movement, one of my concerns is that even as a holiness movement, even as conservative holiness people, two doctrines that trouble me the most: holiness is in danger of being lost, as it is biblically based, which we've heard again this morning about mirroring Christ, being a reflection of who He is. I'm afraid that that's in danger. The second one is the doctrine of sin. I see even in conservative holiness circles, and quite honestly, even in our Bible schools, a shift towards, especially an Augustinian dispensational view of sin. And we have lost the distinctive, and that's why I like Richard Taylor's book, A Right Conception of Sin, but it helps us to understand, the principles involved and why we stand as we do on the matter of sin. Another one that was affected by age, the second highest one, was a cultural shift to a secular society. 63% of the respondents answered that was one of their highest concerns, is this shift to a secular society. But again, what was troubling when you look at the book itself was the age factor. Because for those who had pastored 10 years or less, and when under the age of 45, it wasn't even a majority of them that saw that as a concern. But then those that had pastored 10 to 19 years, then it goes up, and those that were 20 or more. By the time you get to those that had pastored 20 or more years, it was climbing through the 70s. So the age affected that. Poor discipleship models was the third one, addressing complex social issues with biblical integrity. And boy, didn't we hear a masterpiece on that this morning. We're going to have to deal with things. And I'm going to tell you, if you don't think that we're going to face those issues, you have your head in the sand. I mentioned this morning, I was preaching a camp where Darrell Stetler III's involved, and a number of others, out in Stillwater, Oklahoma this summer. And there was an older couple that came to the altar one night. Their daughter, who's married to a pastor in Kansas that are part of the camp, they came to the altar, and they were wrestling because one of my former students here the next day was getting ready to go through the final process of having a sex change. And they were lambasting their parents as not really believing in holiness because they couldn't celebrate with them, their final freedom or whatever. And the parents were heartbroken. How do I deal with this? And how to deal with that in biblical integrity. I'm going to give a story now. And I'm not going to get through all these, but I would encourage you to look that up. But when I pastored at Frankfurt, we had a couple that I'd heard about that they used to teach here. And when I say they were here, they were back in the days of late William Smith, Simeon Smith. But they'd worked here, and he had been a member of the board at our church for years, and a previous pastor, somebody had made accusation, it proved to be true, that he was a homosexual. And that, he had been immoral for years. And of course they stopped coming to church, and he turned in his membership and all that, which he should have. But what troubled me is his wife was an old-time saint. I mean, she just loved the Lord, but she was so humiliated by what happened, but she would not leave the house. I mean, I couldn't get her to darken church. Oh, I know she was praying and reading her Bible, but she was so embarrassed, and the family had been alienated. And I mean, he had stayed, they were together, but they weren't together. And the Lord got to dealing with me, and I told my board, I said, for the sake of the son who was still at home and the mom, I'm going to go after him. Not to justify what he did, but just, I want to see him saved. And so I started going and inviting him. He owned a business right down on the square in Frankfurt, and I started going and inviting him to church and letting him know that we were praying for them. And in a revival, maybe a month or two after that, he hit the altar and was gloriously and wonderfully saved. His wife, of course, Mary, started coming to church. She was so happy that we had shown an interest. And she came to me several times. First of all, he came because he said, there's scars and temptation. What do I do? And I said, Dale, what you need to do is you need to take Mary to work with you every day. You need to build a hedge around yourself. And you need to take her to work with you every day. Do everything you can because the temptation doesn't go away just because the scars of sin remain. And so he did that. And a few weeks later, she came to me and said, oh, Brother Hotle, it's so wonderful. Said, we come home of a night now, we read the Bible together, we pray together. We've never done. She said, God is really doing something. And being a little maybe plain here now, she came to me maybe after 2 or 3 months in. And she said, Brother Hotle, I feel convicted. She said, I know there are concerns, but she said, I feel like that I need to offer myself physically to Dale. We're married. I know there are dangers. But what do you suggest? And I said, Mary, I can't make that decision for you. But I said, if God's prompting you, you just mind whatever you feel God prompting you to do. And she did. It wasn't 2 or 3 weeks later until he got up weeping and testifying that he had been diagnosed with a disease which was going to take his life as a result of all those years of sin. But I'll never forget his testimony. He said, I thank God for this disease. Because he said it takes away an element of any temptation. Because no one wants, this. And he said, I feel like it's God's way of helping me make it. And he did die as a result of that disease. And back to Mary. Mary, later on in widowhood, remarried, but never had any complications. I mean, that God protected her. But one of the most moving sights, when he was dying in the hospital, and I was there the night he died, that son, which had been alienated, he's still living at home, but he was probably 30 years old, had hated his dad after all of the embarrassment. He had gone here to school, at the academy at least. But a night or two before he died, I saw him bring a teddy bear in and give it to his dad and break down, and the two of them embraced and wept. It was beautiful. The night he died, we're there in that room singing hymns, and I was there when he crossed the line of worlds, and I have no doubt that he made it. But the church has got to show compassion without justifying sin. I had another case, and John may remember, I think I shared it then, but we had a couple in our church, and she was an old-fashioned saint. Her husband was as mean as the dickens. Most of the time I was there, never came to church. She was a shouter. But I had heard, even in my church, those whispers, because they'd had a son who years before had been raised, in the church and had decided that he wanted to be a woman and had had the change. And gotten married, adopted a child, and claimed, and I don't want to, I use that, I don't know how to judge them, but claimed then that the Lord saved her, and they were attending a good church. I don't know if the church knew the real issue, but she used to be he. And Harold died of lung cancer, and I dealt with him in the hospital, and he got saved. He actually was able to come to church a few times. He gave his heart to the Lord. There was a radical transformation. And when he died, one thing I wrestled with, you may disagree with me on this, it's okay. I mean, I had to do what I felt was right. But Harold came to me a week or so before he died, and he said, Brother Hotle, I know you don't agree with, and he named his child, but he said, I'd really like for her to sing at my funeral. And I wrestled with it because I knew how my people felt and how I would feel. And I finally went to him. I said, Harold, I don't have a right to tell you who can sing, but as a pastor, I don't feel comfortable with them being on the platform. I just don't. So if she's willing to sing over, behind the flowers, behind the organ, I'm not going to tell you she can't sing, but, I don't want it to seem like I'm condoning, what I don't condone. And he said, I'm fine with that, and she did. That was all right, but the thing that really worried me is that the funeral was on a Saturday, and she came to me and said, Brother Hotle, I'd like to stay and go to church tomorrow. I haven't been in this church since I was a kid. Now, the reason that I was hesitant is I had 3 ladies that would pride themselves in sitting behind the mother, Janet, and say, that thing, they'd do that when he wasn't there. And I could just picture what it would be like if they came and sat together, behind those 3 ladies. And I really worried about it. I dreaded it. I was there on Sunday morning early when they came in, and I'll never forget it. O.D. Williams was dean at Frankfurt Pilgrim College for years, and he was up in years, now retired at my church. And Ruth Williams had taught our young adults for years. And when she saw them walk in, Sister Williams got up, made a beeline for them, threw her arms around him, called her by her male name, and said, I don't agree with what you did, but I want you to know I love you, and I pray for you every day, and you'll always be welcome home. I saw them embrace. I saw them sob. And as I wept looking on, I thought, this is the way it ought to be. He talked about how much it meant, how much they appreciated it. As a church, we have got to stand for truth, but we have to stand with a spirit that says, I don't agree with you, and I think what you're doing is wrong, but I love you, and I pray for you, and God still wants to do something for you. Well, there are other issues, but I'd encourage you to get the book. Anybody else? Thank you for being here. Thank you for allowing me the privilege of being with you again on the Union Bible College campus this week. Love this place. Still pray for it regularly. God bless you.